A U.S. Marine trusted a German shepherd's strange direction and found hope buried in the grass. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, back to our Marine. He wasn't supposed to stop that morning. Staff Sergeant Daniel Rourke had driven this forgotten stretch of prairie 100 times, always with the same empty stare, the same silence sitting heavy in his chest. But today, the light felt different. Thin. Pale. Almost hesitant as it spread across the grasslands of eastern Wyoming. Dew clung to every blade like silver breath, and the earth smelled faintly of rain that had passed hours earlier. The world, in its quiet way, felt like it was waiting. Harper sensed it first. She always did. The sable-coated German shepherd stood in the truck bed the moment Daniel killed the engine, her ears pricking toward a patch of open field where the wind barely seemed to move. She didn't bark. Didn't whine. Just stared, unblinking, insistent, at a direction Daniel would have never looked twice at. "Easy, girl," he murmured, his voice low, worn from years of sandstorms, base alarms, and nights where sleep never fully came. Harper didn't ease. She stepped onto the grass, paws silent, tail low, her body moving with the same certainty she once used when she led Daniel through smoke and confusion overseas. But this wasn't a battlefield. It was an old ranch trail, sun-bleached fence posts leaning like tired shoulders, miles of open land stretching toward a trembling horizon. Daniel watched her take a few steps, then pause, turn, wait for him. That look again. The one that said, "Trust me," he exhaled slowly. Harper had done this twice in the last month, each time stopping over nothing more than a strange scent or a shift in the wind. Trauma, the base counselor had said. Dogs grieve like people. Sometimes deeper. Maybe. But today, something in her stillness worked its way under his ribs. Something quiet. Something Daniel hadn't felt since before the desert took pieces of him he still hadn't gotten back. He followed. The grass brushed his boots, cool and damp. The farther he walked, the more the world softened, sounds dimming, the breeze warming, the sky turning a muted gold as if the sun itself was holding its breath. Harper stopped again. This time her head dipped, ears tilting forward, nose brushing the ground with delicate certainty. Daniel's heartbeat tightened. "Harper, what is it?" She didn't answer, only shifted her weight and looked up at him, eyes bright, steady, urging him closer, urging him to kneel, to see what she felt humming beneath the earth. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel obeyed not with duty, but with faith he didn't know he still carried. Daniel lowered himself slowly, the damp earth pressing a faint chill through the fabric of his jeans as Harper inched closer to the patch of grass that held her unwavering attention. The morning light brushed across her sable coat, turning every strand into a muted shimmer, as if the sun itself was trying to reveal whatever she sensed beneath the surface. Daniel rested one hand against the ground. It felt warm despite the hour, as though the soil held a memory of something that refused to fade. Harper's breath was steady, slow, almost reverent. She nudged a small cluster of bent grass, then looked up at him with that same quiet insistence, the kind that had guided him through smoke-filled afternoons overseas and long nights when memory pressed too heavily against the walls of his chest. "There is nothing here, girl," he whispered, but even as he said it, he knew the words lacked conviction. Harper took a single step back, allowing him room. Daniel brushed the grass aside gently. The scent of earth lifted into the air, rich and grounding, mingling with the faint sweetness of wild sage drifting from the far fence line. A soft breeze moved through the prairie, but around them, the moment felt strangely still, as though the world exhaled and waited. He paused, eyes scanning the field, the endless stretch of muted gold rolling toward the horizon. For months, his days had blended into one another, each one measured by the weight of silence rather than purpose. Harper had been the only constant, the only reminder that life still had small, stubborn sparks hidden in unremarkable places. She lowered her head again, her nose brushing the exact same spot. That was no accident. Harper never repeated a signal unless she was certain. Daniel's heartbeat tightened in a way he had not expected, a quiet pull he had felt only a handful of times in his life, always at moments that pointed him towards something he was not ready to face. He sifted the grass aside further, fingers grazing the soil until they met something firmer beneath the surface. Not sharp. Not cold. Just slightly different from the earth around it. Harper's ears lifted, her tail giving a single slow sweep, the kind she reserved for moments she believed he was finally listening. Daniel inhaled deeply, the air cool in his lungs, carrying the scent of open fields and the faint echo of rain. He felt the weight of the moment settle around him, gentle but real, like a hand resting on his shoulder. "All right," he murmured, letting his voice soften the way he used to when Harper was just a young trainee learning to trust her instincts. "Show me what you found." Harper eased closer, her chest brushing his arm, her warmth steady against the quiet morning. Daniel pressed his palm flat against the grass, brushing away another thin layer, and the earth shifted just enough to reveal the edge of something small, faintly rounded, its surface catching a muted glint of sunlight. He froze. Not from fear, but from the fragile sense that he was standing on the threshold of something meant for him alone, something Harper had understood long before he dared to. The breeze stilled. Harper leaned in. And Daniel felt, for the first time in months, the subtle stir of hope rising like a quiet heartbeat beneath the ground. Daniel brushed a bit more soil aside, revealing a smooth curve no larger than a river stone, its surface touched by a faint sheen as if the morning sun had been waiting for this exact moment to find it. Harper inched forward, her breath warm against his arm, her eyes steady with a quiet knowledge that made the prairie feel smaller, more sacred somehow. Daniel let his fingertips trace the object's edge, and a soft tremor moved through him, not from fear but from recognition he could not yet place. The field around them carried a stillness that felt almost protective, the kind that settles only when something long hidden is ready to be seen. He shifted the earth a little more, careful, slow, letting instinct guide him the same way Harper often did. When the object loosened, the soil released it with a gentle sigh, and Daniel lifted it into the open air. It was a small tin container, weathered along the sides, its metal softened by years of sun and rain. The lid bore a faint indentation, a hand-pressed mark long ago smoothed by time. Harper's ears tilted forward, her tail moving just once, a restrained motion filled with anticipation, as though she understood that whatever rested inside mattered more than either of them knew. Daniel sat back slightly, the grass brushing against his boots, the sky opening above him in quiet shades of pale gold. He turned the tin over in his hands, feeling the warmth from the earth still clinging to the metal. This was no debris left by a passing traveler. It felt intentional, placed, almost entrusted. He hesitated, his breath deepening. He had lived enough years to know that hope does not always arrive wrapped in certainty. Sometimes it arrives in fragments, small enough to fit in a trembling hand. He eased the lid open. The soft click lifted into the morning air, delicate and final. Inside, resting on a piece of folded fabric, was a photograph curled at the edges. The colors were muted from age, but the image was unmistakable. A young boy stood beside a German shepherd, both smiling toward the camera with a light so honest it felt almost warm to the touch. Behind them stretched the same prairie Daniel knelt upon now, only greener, younger, alive with memory. Daniel felt the breath leave his lungs in a slow, steady stream. He recognized the boy. Not by name, not by any personal history, but by the quiet courage held in the child's stance. It was the same resilience Daniel had spent years trying to relearn. Harper leaned her head gently against his shoulder, grounding him, as if reminding him he was not standing at the edge of loss but at the beginning of something he had forgotten how to seek. The photograph trembled slightly between his fingers as another realization settled into him with the softness of a long-delayed truth. The boy wore a simple bracelet braided from red and tan threads, a pattern Daniel had seen before. Tucked inside his late father's belongings, left without explanation. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of Harper's presence steady the quiet ache rising in his chest. When he opened them again, the prairie looked different. Not empty. Not forgotten. Just waiting, the way Harper had been, patient and sure, guiding him towards something he had not yet learned to name. Daniel held the photograph a little closer, letting the soft prairie light settle over its faded colors. The boy's smile, wide and earnest, carried a warmth that seemed to reach across the years, as if the moment captured on that small square of paper had never truly ended. Harper stayed pressed against his shoulder, her breath steady, grounding him in the present while the past quietly unfolded in his hands. The bracelet on the boy's wrist drew Daniel's focus again. Red and tan threads, braided in a pattern he had memorized long before he understood why his father kept it tucked inside a small wooden box. His father had never spoken of his childhood in detail, offering only fragments during long drives or late nights when the house grew still. He had always said that the prairie held memories he was not ready to revisit, memories that taught him how to stand firm and how to let go. Daniel felt a slow ache move through his chest, gentle but undeniable. Harper sensed it and leaned closer, her weight a silent reminder that he was not walking through this alone. The breeze shifted softly, carrying the scent of warm earth and wild sage across the open field. It felt almost like an invitation, a quiet urging for Daniel to keep going, to look deeper, to trust the instinct that had brought him here. He lifted the piece of folded fabric beneath the photograph. Time had worn its edges thin, but the stitching remained intact. It was a handkerchief, small, the fabric soft from age. In one corner, embroidered with uneven but earnest thread, were the initials J.R. Daniel swallowed, the sound small in the vast quiet of the prairie. His father's initials. Harper eased her head under his hand, nudging gently until his fingers rested between her ears. The familiar texture of her fur steadied him, giving him something tangible to hold on to as the moment tightened around him. There was no fear in the realization. Only a strange peace settling through him, like the land itself had been waiting for him to uncover what had been left behind. He let the photograph rest on his palm, studying the horizon behind the boy in the image. The same gentle slope. The same clusters of wild grass. Even the angle of the sunlight matched the morning around him, as though time had folded neatly to allow him to stand in both places at once. "Dad was here," he whispered, not as a declaration but as an understanding that drifted up from somewhere deep. The prairie did not answer, but the silence felt kind, protective. Harper's ears twitched, her gaze shifting to the far edge of the field. She gave a soft rumble, not of warning but of recognition, almost as if she sensed another presence in the memory unfolding before them. Daniel breathed in the warm, earthy air, letting the significance settle gently rather than overwhelm him. The soil beneath his knees, the sky stretching wide above him, the photograph resting in his hand, and Harper at his side all converged into a stillness that felt undeniably purposeful. Hope had not arrived loudly. It had surfaced quietly, tucked inside a forgotten tin beneath the grass, carried by the steady instinct of a dog who somehow knew which direction would lead Daniel home to a truth his father never found the words to share. Daniel let the air settle around him, the photograph resting lightly in his hand while the old handkerchief lay folded across his knee. The warmth of the morning had grown softer, as if the prairie itself understood the tenderness of what he had uncovered. Harper stood close enough that her shoulder brushed his arm, her steady presence acting like a quiet bridge between the man he had been carrying through these months and the one the land seemed to be calling back into place. He traced the initials on the fabric again, the uneven stitching made by a child's hand, unmistakable in its earnestness. J.R. His father had mentioned once, during a winter evening when the house smelled of pine and old books, that he learned to stitch because someone he cared about taught him to mend what mattered. He had never said who. Daniel looked again at the boy in the photograph, the bright grin, the proud posture beside the German shepherd that seemed to mirror Harper's gentle watchfulness. It was not a moment captured by chance. It was a memory anchored to this very land, a moment his father had chosen to bury yet preserve, as if he hoped it would one day find its way to the right hands. Daniel felt the wind begin to move again, a slow, warm drift that carried across the grass like a whispered encouragement. Harper lifted her nose, scenting it, her ears giving a tiny flick as though she heard something beyond his reach. She stepped forward a few inches, pressing her paw gently against the ground where the tin had rested, then looked back at him. The message was clear in her gaze. There was more. Daniel inhaled, letting the truth settle fully, not rushed, not clouded. Hope was a quiet thing, he realized, often small enough to fit inside a forgotten box or a single memory left waiting beneath the soil. He placed the photograph and handkerchief carefully back into the tin, leaving the lid open so the sunlight could warm them. He rested his hand on the earth for a long moment, palm flat against the soil that had held the past so patiently. The land hummed with the faint vibrancy of life waking under the sun. A meadowlark called somewhere in the distance, its clear, bright notes carrying across the open space. Harper moved closer, nudging Daniel's shoulder once, then settling at his side with a soft sigh. The prairie stretched out around them, endless and gentle, no longer empty but full in a way he had not felt in years. He lifted his gaze toward the horizon, the soft gold of the morning deepening into a calm, steady light. His father had been here. His childhood had unfolded across this very field, guided by a dog who looked so much like Harper that it made Daniel's breath catch for a moment. Maybe that was why Harper had felt drawn here, why her steps grew certain as they neared this spot. Sometimes bonds do not end, he thought. They echo quietly through generations, carried by instinct, by memory, by the gentle pull of something greater than understanding. And as he sat there, hand resting on the earth and Harper leaning against him, Daniel felt the subtle truth settling into place. This discovery was not about the past alone. It was nudging him toward what came next. Daniel stayed still for a long moment, letting the prairie breathe around him, its quiet rhythm settling into his chest like a steadying hand. Harper sat close enough that her fur brushed against his sleeve, her warmth anchoring him as his thoughts unfolded gently, without the rush or weight that had followed him through so many months. The photograph had stirred something tender, a recognition not just of his father's past but of a silence that had lived between them, a silence that now felt less like distance and more like protection. He lifted the open tin again, letting the sunlight warm the metal. The photograph and handkerchief rested inside, small, simple pieces of another life, yet carrying the kind of truth that does not demand attention but invites it. Harper lowered her head, sniffing the air above the tin, then looked toward the far ridge where the land sloped into a gentle hollow touched by soft shadows. Her ears lifted, focused. Daniel followed her gaze, his eyes narrowing slightly against the growing brightness. The hollow was not far, maybe a few hundred yards across the grass. Nothing marked it from a distance, but the way Harper watched it made Daniel's breath slow. She gave a quiet rumble, not a warning, but the same sound she had made when guiding him towards something she needed him to understand. "There is more, is that it?" Daniel asked softly. Harper shifted her weight forward, then looked back at him, her eyes steady with that familiar certainty. Daniel rose with care, brushing stray blades of grass from his jeans. The ground felt warm beneath his boots as he stepped toward the hollow, Harper walking beside him with a quiet, purposeful grace. The prairie opened wider with each step, the horizon stretching like a soft line drawn in light. Daniel carried the tin in his hand, holding it with a kind of reverence, as though the memories inside could feel the air for the first time in years. He walked slowly, letting the moment guide him rather than push him. Harper occasionally brushed her shoulder against his leg, an unspoken reassurance that the path was not meant to be taken alone. As they neared the hollow, Daniel felt the air shift. The warmth deepened, the breeze softened, and a faint scent of blooming sage drifted across the field. It felt familiar in a way that made his chest tighten, a scent tied to a childhood memory he had never fully understood. Harper stepped ahead, stopping at the edge of the dip in the land. She looked down, her ears tilting forward. Daniel joined her, his eyes tracing the gentle curve of the earth. Nothing appeared unusual at first, just grass swaying lightly in the breeze. But then he saw it. A single wooden post, weathered and half sunk into the ground, almost swallowed by the tall grass around it. No markings. No obvious purpose. Just a quiet sentinel left standing against time. Harper approached it slowly, nose brushing the wood as though greeting something long familiar. Daniel felt a faint tremor move through him, a subtle recognition that did not come from sight but from something deeper, as if his father's voice had once risen from this very place in a memory Daniel never witnessed but somehow carried. He stepped closer, the tin resting against his chest, the sunlight warming his shoulders. The hollow felt like a breath held for decades, waiting for this moment, waiting for someone who could finally understand why a boy had once stood on this land with a dog at his side, smiling toward a future he had not yet lived. And as Daniel placed his hand upon the weathered post, gentle and slow, he felt the connection settle through him, quiet and undeniable, as if the prairie itself whispered that he was standing not at the end of a memory, but at the beginning of something meant to be reclaimed. Daniel let his fingers rest lightly on the weathered post, the wood warm beneath his touch as if it had absorbed decades of sunlight and held them gently, waiting for a moment like this. Harper stood beside him with her head slightly lowered, her breath steady, her presence calm, as though she recognized the significance before he fully could. The hollow around them was quiet in a different way than the open prairie above. The air felt thicker, almost tender, carrying a faint sweetness of blooming sage mixed with the earthy scent of grass warmed by morning light. Daniel lifted the tin closer to his chest, his thumb brushing over the faint edge of the old photograph through the metal. He felt a pull, not physical, but emotional, a quiet nudge toward listening. More closely to the land beneath his boots. His father had once said that truth does not always arrive in sharp moments. Sometimes it comes softly, through small details you only notice when you finally stop running. Daniel had not understood the meaning back then, but now it drifted back to him with unexpected clarity. Harper circled the post slowly, nose close to the ground, pausing every few steps. She looked up at him, her amber eyes filled with a gentle insistence. Daniel knelt beside the post and pressed his hand to the earth. It was warm, almost warmer than the sunlight could explain. The wooden beam, softened by years of wind and rain, leaned at a slight angle as if bowing to the memory it guarded. He noticed faint impressions in the soil, old indentations, almost erased by time, yet present enough to suggest something had once rested here. Something meaningful. He exhaled slowly, letting the quiet settle. "Dad, what were you trying to leave behind?" The question was not spoken into the air but rather into the moment itself, carried by the stillness as though the land might answer. Harper stepped closer and pressed her nose gently into Daniel's hand, nudging it toward the base of the post. He brushed aside a small cluster of grass. Beneath it, the soil dipped slightly, forming a shallow depression almost too subtle to notice. But Harper noticed. She always noticed. Daniel's heartbeat softened into a slow, contemplative rhythm. He lifted a handful of the loose soil, revealing a small scattering of polished pebbles, smooth, rounded, arranged in a faint crescent pattern. Childhood craftsmanship. A quiet signature. He remembered the way his father used to skim polished stones into his coat pockets during their rare trips to the river, turning them over in his hands as if feeling the echoes of something long past. These stones captured that same softness. Harper let out a breath, a delicate sound almost like relief. Daniel felt a warm weight settle inside him. The hollow was not just a place, it was a pause in time, a moment his father had crafted, a place where the boy in the photograph had stood with hope bright in his eyes. Daniel let his fingers drift through the stones, the smooth surfaces warming to his touch. He realized, with a quiet certainty, that he was not uncovering a burial or a secret meant to remain hidden. He was discovering a memory intentionally placed, a message passed through earth and time, waiting for the right footsteps to return. And as Harper leaned her head gently into his shoulder, Daniel understood that hope had not been buried here to be forgotten. It had been planted, so it could someday be found. Daniel let the polished stones rest in his palm, their smooth surfaces warming quickly as if they recognized the touch of a familiar bloodline. Harper stayed close, her flank brushing against his knee, her steady presence grounding him in a way he had not realized he needed. The hollow held a gentleness that felt almost deliberate, as though the land had shaped itself around a memory and waited patiently for someone willing to listen. Daniel looked again at the weathered post, its grain worn soft by time, its lean subtle but meaningful, the way a person might bow their head in quiet reflection. This was not a marker of grief. It felt more like a place where someone once paused to find courage, or to leave a piece of themselves behind for another to discover. Harper lowered her head, sniffing along the base of the post, then nudged a patch of grass just to the right of it. Daniel brushed the grass aside, revealing a shallow indentation in the soil, circular and smooth around the edge. He recognized it instantly, a sit spot. Dogs often pick a single place to rest, a place that feels like their own small corner of the world. The boy in the photograph had likely stood here with his canine companion, the bond between them etched silently into the earth. The thought softened something inside Daniel, a quiet ache loosening its grip as he imagined his father as a boy, laughing under a similar sky, the prairie wind tugging at his shirt while a loyal German shepherd stood guard at his side. Harper looked up at Daniel, her amber eyes holding a brightness that felt almost knowing. He reached out and scratched behind her ears, feeling her lean gently into his touch. "You knew," he whispered. It was not a question. Harper had walked him here with the same certainty she had shown in the field above when she sensed something beneath the grass. She had followed more than scent or instinct. She had followed something deeper, something Daniel could only describe as a quiet pull of the heart. The wind shifted again, carrying a soft warmth across the hollow. Sagebrush rustled lightly along the ridge, and a faint hum filled the air, the kind that settles right before the land reveals something more. Daniel placed the stones back where he found them, arranging them gently into the small crescent shape the boy once made. The simple formation felt like a bridge, connecting past to present with a gesture so small it nearly broke him with its tenderness. Harper lifted her head toward the horizon, ears pricked, alert but calm. Daniel followed her gaze and noticed the light changing. The sun had climbed high enough that the shadow of the post stretched long across the hollow floor, pointing toward a cluster of taller grass on the far side. It seemed insignificant at first, just another patch of prairie, but something about the way the shadow aligned with it stirred Daniel's curiosity. Harper began walking toward it, slow and sure, glancing back only once to ensure he followed. He did. The grass rustled softly as they approached, the golden blades swaying in a rhythm that felt almost like breathing. Daniel crouched beside Harper, pressing his hand into the earth again. It felt warm and steady, the kind of warmth that suggested something lingered just beneath the surface, waiting for him to uncover it. And as Harper nosed a delicate circle into the grass, Daniel felt the quiet truth rising, patient and gentle, ready to be found. Daniel parted the tall grass gently, the blades bending beneath his hand with a soft whisper, as if the prairie itself exhaled in anticipation. Harper moved beside him with deliberate calm, her nose lowering to the earth, tracing the faint circle she had begun moments earlier. The ground felt warmer here, the warmth rising in a steady, quiet pulse that made Daniel pause. He pressed his palm flat against the soil. A subtle vibration thrummed beneath his skin, not a sound, not truly a movement, but a sense of presence that stirred something deep within him. Harper let out a soft breath, almost a hush, as though she understood what was about to surface. Daniel brushed aside another layer of grass. Beneath it lay a small indentation, shallow and imperfect, shaped almost like a bowl carved lightly into the earth. In its center rested a single object half hidden under dust and weather, a brass button, dulled by age but unmistakable in its design. Daniel lifted it carefully. The metal warmed instantly against his palm. He recognized the emblem stamped into its surface. It was from an old jacket issued decades ago, the kind worn long before his father ever served. Daniel swallowed, his voice caught somewhere between memory and discovery. "Dad, this was yours." Harper stepped closer, her eyes lifting to Daniel with a depth that steadied him through the sudden swell of emotion. The prairie wind stilled again, holding the moment intact as if the land wanted him to feel every thread of connection pulling gently across time. He turned the button over, tracing the tiny ridges around its edge. It matched the empty spot on the jacket folded inside his father's cedar chest at home, the one Daniel had kept but never fully understood. Harper nosed the earth again, pushing gently at the soil just past where the button had rested. Daniel followed her lead. A small wear pattern revealed itself in the ground, the kind made when someone sits in the same place many times, imprinting moments into the earth until they become part of it. He pictured the boy from the photograph sitting here, legs crossed, jacket too big for his small frame, a dog curled beside him as they watched the light change across the prairie. The image formed so vividly that Daniel felt his breath catch. It was not grief. It was recognition. Harper nudged his hand, urging him to look just a little further. He shifted some grass aside and found a shallow groove behind the indentation, shaped like someone had rested their back against the earth and leaned into the curve of the land for comfort. A secret seat. A quiet place where a child came to think. Daniel let his fingers follow the groove, feeling the earth's softness. It was a place built by repetition, patient and familiar, a place someone returned to again and again because it felt safe. Because it felt like home. Harper's tail gave a slow, gentle sweep across the grass, the kind she offered only during moments of quiet truth. Daniel pressed the button to his chest, the warmth radiating through the fabric of his shirt. He had come here searching for nothing more than a moment of silence, yet the land had given him a fragment of his father's story, stitched into the earth by hands long gone but never forgotten. And as he knelt there, the prairie light softening around him, Daniel felt the unmistakable rise of something long buried and unexpectedly tender. Hope, small and quiet, lifting its head through the grass. Daniel held the brass button against his chest for a quiet moment, letting its warmth steady him as the prairie light softened into a gentle midday glow. Harper stayed close, her presence calm and certain, her eyes following his every small movement as though she understood how fragile this discovery felt. Daniel took a slow breath and let his hand fall back to the shallow indentation in the earth, the place where a boy had once rested with trust in his heartbeat and sunlight on his face. He brushed the soil gently, lifting a bit more of the surrounding grass. A faint shimmer caught in the shifting light. Not bright. Not deliberate. Just a soft glint, the kind that only appears when the world is still enough for attention to sharpen. Harper lowered her head, nose brushing the ground where the shimmer hid. Daniel reached carefully into the grass and felt something thin and soft, smoothed by age. He lifted it out with slow hands. It was a ribbon. Faded blue, edges frayed, tied in a careful knot that had held for decades. The knot was the kind a child makes with earnest fingers, too tight in places, slightly loose in others, yet holding firm against time. Daniel felt his breath catch. His father had once mentioned a blue ribbon that belonged to someone important to him, someone whose memory always softened his eyes. He had never shared details, only said that the ribbon represented courage in small steps and promises kept in quiet places. Daniel held it gently, feeling the weight of meaning woven through every fiber. Harper nosed the ribbon softly, then looked at Daniel with a calm insistence, as if urging him to see the ribbon not just as an object, but as a message deliberately left where hope could find it. The wind brushed across the hollow, lifting the tall grass into a slow sway. The scent of sage drifted around them, warm and comforting. The sky above stretched open and blue, wide enough to carry every unspoken memory across its calm expanse. Daniel tied the ribbon loosely around his fingers, careful not to loosen the original knot. The simple texture grounded him. It felt like holding a whisper from a childhood he had never witnessed but somehow carried within him. He let his eyes scan the hollow again, the way the light curved around the edges, the shadows falling in soft crescents. It was not a place of sadness. It was a place someone returned to for guidance, for comfort, for stillness. Harper stepped forward, her tail giving a gentle sweep. She pressed her nose to the earth again, tracing a small path that led a few feet beyond the indentation. Daniel followed her, the ribbon swaying slightly with each step. The ground sloped inward just a little, revealing a faint line of stones arranged in a way that seemed too intentional to be natural. They formed a narrow arch, the shape subtle but unmistakable, as though marking the boundary of a space meant to hold something sacred. Daniel knelt again, brushing the stones with gentle fingers. Each one felt smooth and warm, arranged with a care that mirrored the crescent stones behind them. Whoever placed them had understood that meaning does not always require words. Harper settled at his side, resting her head lightly against his shoulder. Daniel felt a quiet shift inside him, a softening in places that had been closed for too long. He understood now. The prairie was not revealing pieces of the past. It was revealing pieces of truth his father had tucked into the earth with the hope that one day his son would return and learn how to see through silence. And as Daniel held the blue ribbon and the brass button together, he felt the unmistakable rise of something gentle and enduring. Hope, not just stirring, but beginning to take shape. Daniel remained kneeling at the stone arch, the blue ribbon resting across his palm and the brass button warm against his fingers. Harper stayed pressed beside him, her quiet breathing steady and sure, as though she sensed that the moment unfolding here required a stillness deeper than words. The prairie light stretched long across the hollow, softening into a warm glow that touched every inch of earth with a gentleness that felt almost intentional. Daniel lifted his eyes toward the horizon and felt, for the first time in months, a looseness in his chest that did not come from exhaustion but from release. The ribbon fluttered slightly in the breeze, the knot at its center refusing to come undone despite decades of weather. It felt like a lesson woven into its threads: some bonds do not weaken with time, they deepen in silence. Harper nudged his knee lightly, then looked toward the stone arch again, urging him to pay closer attention. Daniel shifted one of the stones with careful fingers, not altering the shape but clearing away a layer of dust and old grass. Underneath, the earth was darker, richer, untouched by the years above it. He brushed it gently and felt the texture, smooth yet firm, as if something had once been placed there, something meant to rest but not disappear. He realized then that the hollow was more than a childhood meeting place. It was a sanctuary, a quiet corner of the world where a boy had learned to listen to the land, to trust a loyal dog, and to tuck pieces of memory into the soil so the wind would not carry them away. Daniel breathed in the warm scent of sage, letting the thought settle gently through him. He placed the ribbon beside the stones, not to leave it behind but to let the place feel the touch of it again, as if offering the land a moment of recognition. Harper shifted and placed her paw softly near the ribbon, her touch gentle, almost reverent. Daniel smiled faintly. "You feel it too," he whispered. Harper looked up at him, her eyes deep and steady, reflecting the same quiet conviction that had guided them through the grass and down into this hollow without hesitation. Daniel closed his hand around the ribbon once more, the fabric softening against his palm as though warmed by understanding. The button, still in his other hand, glinted under the sunlight, a reminder that even the smallest fragments can carry stories powerful enough to reach across generations. He looked around the hollow, taking in every detail: the curve of the land, the placement of the stones, the shadow of the leaning post stretching like a bridge between past and present. He felt a connection settle into place, steady and whole. His father had not brought him here in life, but he had guided him here in the only way he knew. How? Through quiet clues, through objects left intentionally in the hands of time, through the soft wisdom of a land that remembers everything. Harper stepped closer, leaning her weight into him, grounding him in the moment with a warmth that eased every lingering ache. Daniel rested his forehead briefly against her head, letting gratitude wash through him in slow, even waves. The wind lifted again, gentle and warm, carrying not just the scent of earth but the unmistakable feeling of a blessing released into the air. And Daniel understood that he had not simply uncovered remnants of the boy his father once was. He had uncovered the path toward who he was meant to become. Daniel rose slowly from the stone arch, the ribbon looped gently around his fingers and the brass button resting against his palm like a heartbeat held in metal. Harper stayed at his side, her steps soft, her gaze steady on him as if she felt the shift happening inside him before he fully understood it himself. The prairie had grown quieter, not from stillness but from a kind of reverence, the way a church softens when someone finally understands the prayer they have been whispering for years. Daniel turned toward the slope that led out of the hollow. The sunlight washed over the ridge in a warm, honeyed glow, casting long shadows that stretched toward him like guiding hands. Harper nudged his leg lightly, encouraging him forward. As they climbed, Daniel felt the earth under his boots change, from the rich softness of the hollow to the firmer ground of the open field. Each step felt like moving through a doorway, leaving behind a room built from memory and stepping into one shaped by purpose. When they reached the ridge, the land unfolded before them in a sweeping expanse of gold and pale green, the kind of view that stops thought and replaces it with breath. The sky above stretched wide and unbroken, a canvas of gentle blue with wisps of cloud drifting like quiet promises. Daniel paused, letting the wind brush across his face, warm and steady. Harper sat beside him, her ears tilted slightly forward as though she listened to something he could not hear. He opened his hand and looked at the ribbon and button again. They no longer felt like artifacts. They felt like anchors, small reminders that grief does not end with closure but transforms into guidance when the heart is ready. Daniel slid the brass button into his pocket, letting it rest close to him. The ribbon he tied loosely around his wrist, the knot resting against his pulse like a silent vow. The moment he tightened it, Harper lifted her head and pressed her shoulder against his leg, a gesture so full of quiet understanding that Daniel felt the air leave his lungs in a soft, grateful exhale. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice low but sure. He did not need to say more. Harper rose and took a few steps forward, looking back at him with a gentle invitation. She was ready to continue, and now, Daniel realized, so was he. They walked through the tall grass together, the blades brushing softly against their legs, their movements slow and unhurried. Each step felt lighter than the last, as though the land had lifted some invisible weight from him and replaced it with something far more enduring. Hope was no longer a fragile spark beneath the ground. It was rising with him, steady and warm, taking shape in the rhythm of Harper's footsteps and the quiet conviction settling through his chest. As they crossed the field, Daniel felt a truth unfurl inside him, one his father had never spoken aloud but had left behind in pieces small enough for the land to carry. Faith does not always arrive in miracles. Sometimes it arrives in whispers, in instincts, in the soft direction of a loyal companion guiding you toward the version of yourself you forgot how to believe in. And with Harper walking beside him, the prairie stretching open like a promise, Daniel understood that he was no longer searching for what he had lost. He was walking toward what he was meant to find. Daniel and Harper moved across the open field with an ease that felt almost like memory guiding their steps, the sunlight softening into a mellow gold that stretched across the prairie like a gentle hand. The wind carried a quiet warmth, brushing Daniel's face with the same tenderness his father once used when adjusting his collar before school, a gesture so faint in his recollection yet suddenly vivid in the hush of the afternoon. Harper walked slightly ahead, her tail moving in slow, thoughtful arcs, glancing back at him with an expression that seemed to ask not for permission but for acknowledgement of how far he had come. The ribbon around Daniel's wrist fluttered lightly with each step, the knot tapping gently against his pulse, as if reminding him of the promise that had settled quietly into his heart. The land around them, once heavy with unanswered questions, now felt open, spacious, filled with possibility rather than ache. They reached a small rise at the far edge of the field, where the prairie dipped into a gentle valley dotted with wildflowers that leaned toward the sun. Daniel stopped there, letting the view expand before him. It was a simple landscape, almost plain in its honesty, yet it held a depth that echoed through him with unexpected clarity. He felt Harper press her head against his leg, a soft, grounding gesture that pulled him fully into the present. Daniel rested his hand on her back, feeling the steady rise and fall of her breath beneath his palm. It reminded him of the constancy he had missed in himself, the steadiness he had long believed was lost somewhere between distant deployments and quiet nights filled with unanswered prayers. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of the sun settle across his face, letting the breeze wrap gently around him as though carrying the echo of a voice he had not heard in years. Not in words, but in the quiet sense of being seen, of being guided, of being known. When he opened his eyes again, the world felt changed. Not because the prairie had shifted, but because he had. The hollow, the stones, the ribbon, the button, all of it formed a thread that reached from the boy his father once was to the man Daniel was becoming, stitched together by the instinct of a dog who understood better than logic ever could. Harper lifted her head and looked up at him with a softness that steadied everything inside him. Daniel knelt beside her, placing both hands gently on her shoulders. "You brought me here," he murmured. "You brought me back." Harper leaned into his touch, her eyes warm, her presence unwavering. Daniel felt the truth rise through him, quiet but sure. Hope had not been buried in the grass. It had been waiting for him to kneel, to listen, to let go of the silence he had carried for far too long. He rose slowly, brushing his hand across the tall blades of grass that swayed like a gentle farewell. The field behind him no longer felt like a place of loss. It felt like a beginning. Daniel took a step forward, Harper matching his pace, their shadows stretching long across the prairie as the sun dipped lower in the sky. And in the vast, open quiet of that golden afternoon, Daniel understood that grace does not always descend from the heavens. Sometimes it rises from the earth, lifted by the steady paws of a loyal companion who refuses to let a soul stay lost.